This is a video about a man named Stanley, or rather, people like Stanley. Stanley is a video game player character, an avatar. In his game, Stanley is an average working-class white man, and although others might find him boring, he was the most common demographic of video game avatar. Stanley works at a company where he presses buttons, until a player takes his agency and makes him ignore or listen to a narrator's instructions. Today that narrator is making Stanley watch a video essay about video game avatars.
Hello, I'm manipulating you. It's already started by saying that I'm forming the way that you see me, see this art, see the world. This costume, this makeup, the green screen, the color grading, it's all to create an effect on the audience. If you're a good artist, you do it with intention and without the audience noticing. However, I want you to notice framing, to notice narratives and to question them, including mine. When art is non-interactive, it engenders a readiness to accept what is being presented. In a passive medium, such as, a video essay, the audience is forced to experience the perspective of the author. You can only choose to stop or continue experiencing the work. This still leaves a vast amount to be interpreted by the audience, but the work itself is, to some degree, rooted in place. John Berger, in Ways of Seeing, argues that before image reproduction, art was fundamentally of a place. While this is true for the art of the upper classes of Europe, participatory art has always been ephemeral, always everywhere and nowhere. It's sailors singing sea shanties and Irish working class people figuring out ways to dance that wouldn't get banned, and it's me and my girlfriend dancing and singing to a song on a Friday while waiting for some food to cook. But most of all, it's found in play. Play can occur anywhere, but each instance, even as rules create similarities, will be unique to those who engage in the act of play. Sometimes all it needs is your eyes staring into someone else's, until one of you blinks. Seeing through play is experiential, democratized, able to be observed not just by those who are in it, but by those outside of it. Berger states that seeing comes before words. I would argue play does too. Play is one of the first methods by which we relate to other beings. Play is not just a work of art that exists in a time or a place, but it exists in the people who engage in it. Play is universal, and in that universality and its participatory nature is a power to motivate identification with the other. This identification is furthered when image reproduction intersects with play. Take sports spectatorship, especially the image reproduction that is televised sport. Viewers identify themselves with players and teams. They state things like, "We won," when the team they attach identity to succeeds. The other becomes tied to the self. Video game avatars are unique amongst fictional characters in how they can create an identification with the other within the audience. They are often, though not exclusively, the perspective through which players experience a world, and as such express a great deal about the ways of seeing expected of players. The interactive nature, customizability, and agency of video game avatars provide a unique and powerful tool for understanding perspectives beyond one's own. They also allow marginalized people to see ourselves as subjects and not just objects. However, this capacity is stifled by a medium still predominantly focused on seeing through the eyes of the privileged.
I mean, don't get me wrong, it's cute that y'all think you're the heroes of this little adventure, but you're not.
Gordon W. Allport's concept of contact hypothesis, and the research that has been done based on it, shows that one of the most effective methods of decreasing bias between privileged and marginalized group members is interpersonal contact. Schiappa et al. Expanded on the concept in Parasocial Contact Hypothesis, proposing that
if people process mass-mediated parasocial interaction in a manner similar to interpersonal interaction, then the socially beneficial functions of intergroup contact may result from parasocial contact.
They used multiple studies, all concluding that the level of prejudice amongst privileged group members decreased upon positive parasocial contact. While anecdotal, I've witnessed this phenomena in the response to my work and my colleagues' work. Comments on our videos stating that we've changed their perspective, opened their minds to understanding groups they had been previously bigoted towards. This doesn't mean that bigotry would magically disappear if everybody watched Demona, merely that exposure to perspectives and worldviews beyond one's own can have a beneficial impact. What this means in the context of video games is if players experience a parasocial relationship to video game avatars, those avatars hold the potential to lower prejudice. By the way, this is exactly why the right fights so hard against diversity in media. It's because they know it works super strongly against their perspective and their propaganda. It's kind of hard to justify wanting to end all trans people's lives if you see us as human beings, after all. Poster et al.'s A Matter of Closeness Player-Avatar Relationships as Degree of Including Avatar in the Self, God, that's a long name, lays out a framework for understanding the degree of closeness that players feel towards the avatars they control. A small number of players, the functional PAR, player-avatar relationship, sees the avatar as nothing more than a playing piece. This group is relevant because not everyone will connect meaningfully with their avatars. While the medium can create connection, it can also incept the inverse. Every other PAR demonstrates emotional attachment, including some beyond the levels we see in passive mediums. Empathy-based dyadic PARs
perceive their avatars as independent entities, but become emotionally involved by witnessing what happens to them in a game.
And for the intensive dyadic PARs,
the avatar is experienced as a close other, like a good friend, which resembles parasocial or fully social relationships.
These two groups resemble the experience of viewers of passive mediums. They, as such, satisfy the requirements for reducing prejudice through parasocial contact. The two types of PARs most interesting to me are those who incorporate the avatar as part of their self. Selective identification PRs who
reported that the boundaries between their selves and the avatars begin to blur. Empirical manifestations of including an avatar's characteristics in the self, while primarily identifying with idealized character traits or abilities.
And the shift of identity PARs exhibit a
feeling of being the avatar with all their goals and perspective. This also implies that through identity shifts, game avatars allow players experiencing entirely new situations firsthand or explore possible selves.
As such, these last two groups, particularly shift of identity, go above and beyond what is seen in passive mediums. Meaning that video games may hold a capacity not just to reduce prejudice through parasocial contact, but to get a privileged viewer to genuinely consider the marginalized perspective. As well, Renicky and Tirrrb found that
the player's identification with the avatar seems to be crucial for experiencing entertainment, but is not necessarily tied to similarity. Players might identify with dissimilar avatars depending on the type of game and on their satisfaction with life.
These elements combine to show that positive identification is not predicated on player-avatar similarity, and that in some cases, dissimilarity may actually increase identification. This potential to create connection is rarely engaged with due to the medium primarily placing players in the shoes of the privileged. That statement should be fairly obviously true, and yet would be extremely controversial amongst gamers, who seem to think that white men are no longer playable characters. It's particularly noticeable in recent situations, such as the interesting, very emotionally mature responses some gamers had to Hades 2's player character being Melanoe.
Another woke doo-doo? Playing as a woman, Lamau.
Why all corporations are putting girls as main characters? What's up with this? I'm a guy, and I want to play as a guy. Is there choice in this game?
The story is so bad. they clearly focused on making the game woke instead of the writing.
The first game was phenomenal. The devs caved to the woke. Such a shame.
A little bit gay, but good game.
While filming this, a second situation occurred in which people threw very normal... I can't call it anything other than racist, sexist tantrums about the main characters of Assassin's Creed's newest installment. That's a real person. That's based on a real person. It is not historically inaccurate to represent a real human being that existed in the time period.
So while editing, there was a third example. A bunch of weirdo chuds threw tantrums because there's a game called Paper Trail. As the developers of the game put it, "Oh no, the woke content detector found us. If only we hadn't included a checks notes female character that goes to university." I'm just gonna let that sink in a little bit. It's actually so absurd, the degree of blatant bigotry in this community. The game was review bombed from an 8.0 to 5.4 on Metacritic.
Okay. Okay.
William et al.'s The Virtual Census, Representations of Gender, Race, and Age in Video Games, published in 2009 but based on data from 2005, covered the identity and diversity of characters in games at that time. Both player avatars, referred to as primary characters in this study, and NPCs, referred to as secondary characters in this study, were predominantly men. As well, the percentage of primary characters that were men was higher than the percentage of secondary characters.
It's also worth noting the extreme overrepresentation of whiteness.
According to Very Normal Men Online, everything's flipped since then. It's totally changed. Unfortunately for their feelings, facts exist. The trends discussed back in the 2000s have actually continued to this day. Harrison et al. Continued the work of William et al. In 2020 with the Virtual Census 2.0, a continued investigation of the representation of gender, race, and age in video games using the same methodology, now applied to the top-selling games of 2017. They found that
while the proportion of overall female characters nearly doubled, this increase was primarily due to non-playable secondary roles.
Predetermined player avatars are very rarely women, and even as NPC character makeup has shifted somewhat, women are still not being placed in the position of subject. Also, a reminder that doubling roughly 15% is still only 30%, which is significantly less than half. For a bunch of whiny weirdos who say you care about realism, I think you'd care about this, wouldn't you? Oh, right, it's just because you hate women. Right, I forgot. Anita Sarkeesian and Carolyn Petit in Female Representation in Video Games Isn't Getting Any Better examine the genders of player avatars in games presented at E3, at the time the largest video game industry expo, for the years 2015 to 2019. The majority of games either provided multiple options, gender was not applicable, or gender was ambiguous. However, when isolating for games where the protagonist options only had one, men significantly outnumbered women still. These findings are also reflected in Diamond Lobby's reports on diversity in gaming for 2017 to 2021 and the 2022 supplement. The reports only look at games where you could not fully customize characters and only looked at releases from the biggest publishers and the 10 highest selling games from each of the years. As such, the subset represents the views espoused by the groups with the most power and influence within the field. In 2022, they found that only 28% of major releases had more playable women than men, and 26% had an equal number. In the report on games from 2017 to 2021, 79.2% of main characters in games were men, and 31.7% of games only had men as playable characters. It's worth noting that these biases are also reflected in the predominance of white playable characters and other privileged identities, that the sexism, racism, and other bigoted biases intersect and compound with each other in these datasets. William et al. State in their section on why game representation matters that
a medium's general depiction of a group does have an impact on its users' perceptions of that group, albeit moderated by their real-world experiences. If such a consistent pattern of representation on television can have effects, as Mastro et al. Show, a consistent pattern in other media may do so as well. This is especially relevant as games begin to displace prior media as the dominant symbol sets for many Americans.
Bell Hooks, in The Oppositional Gaze, states that
Talking with black men of all ages and classes in different areas of the United States about their filmic-looking relations, I hear again and again ambivalent responses to cinema.
Which, as she discusses in that paper, is a direct result of misogynoir, the intersection of racism and sexism. Both need to be contended with simultaneously. The games industry has consistently, for decades, primarily asked players to take on the role of able-bodied allo-cishet white men, to not just gaze, but manipulate from that intersection of perspectives.
Representation can have identity and self-esteem effects on individuals from those groups. The presence of the group, including within games, serves as a marker for members to know that they carry weight in society. Conversely, the absence of portrayals should lead to a feeling of relative unimportance and powerlessness.
Despite the pathetic insistence of Gamergate 2 types that the industry is controlled by the woke, the reality is that marginalized people rarely get to see ourselves as agents, as subjects, both in life and within the makeup of player avatars.
Stanley had paused the essay, but, being a good little listener, dutifully clicked play again. Stanley sat there like he didn't know exactly what he was supposed to be doing. Stanley, is something bothering you? It seems Stanley was upset that he was an example of this privileged perspective. As a character created to represent the average player avatar, Stanley had accidentally reflected the biases of the medium he belonged to. When Stanley's creators had sought to make an everyman, they made a white cis man in his 40s. It was likely upsetting Stanley that he was part of the problem. Perhaps that's why he had paused the essay. No? Well, what did you want, Stanley? Maybe if Stanley watched more, he could find out.
You're gonna knock him dead at the Veterans Hall tonight, hun.
You think?
Absolutely. Now get ready and stop hogging the mirror.
Right.
Mirrors are often used in games as a demonstration of technical achievement. However, they also serve the additional use of showing the avatar to the player. One of the major visuals of Prey 2017, for instance, is the main character gazing at themselves in their mirror. What makes this interesting is the game gives the choice to play Morgan Yu as a man or a woman, but marketing often uses male Morgan. Prey's not unique for this. It is only one of many games which do this, showing that for some marketing teams, even when a choice is available, they'll assume embodying a man is more appealing. The person they expect you to want to see in the mirror is a man. Undertale, a game that plays with agency and players being separate entities from their avatars, and which I'm working on a large essay about, uses a mirror for very poignant exploration of identity and mapping self to avatar. In the first instance of the mirror early in the game, when activated, it will state, "It's you," identifying player and avatar together. Much later in the game, if you've done a pacifist or neutral route, a route where you did not maximize harm towards others, the second mirror, a purposeful callback to the first, states, "Despite everything, it's still you." However, in a No Mercy route, a playthrough where you've killed everyone else in the underground, the mirror instead reads, "It's me," the name you entered at the start of the game. The game's avatar Frisk has a canonical name, meaning that the game is identifying you as separate from Frisk, much more directly in a route where you force the avatar to enact terrible violence. In a true pacifist route, one where you not only did no harm but do additional acts of caring kindness, the mirror will read upon returning to it in the epilogue, "Still just you, Frisk." By displaying empathy you have the agency to refuse, you become so identified with the avatar as to become one and the same explicitly. Undertale as an overall text is in part about examining the relationship between avatars and players. It is incredibly embedded in conversation with the history of the medium, pulling on and commenting on many genres and tropes. The primary avenue that player agency is given through is the choice between empathy and violence. In so doing, it draws attention to the predominance of the medium treating agency as being manifested through violence. It's important to understand that exploring what violence means and does through art is a valuable act. I am not arguing that violence in video games is bad, quite the opposite. Instead, I'm saying it's worth questioning how and to what end that exploration is done. Who gets to do violence, and how does it relate to dominant cultural views, should be something you examine. As I discussed heavily in my video on Nimona last year, there's a vast difference between liberatory violence and the systemic violence of dominant socioeconomic groups. You should question why so much of media presents cop violence as a positive thing, for example. As discussed in female representation in video games isn't getting any better, 85% of games in Sarkeesian Petit's data involves combat as a primary mechanic. The predominant way of seeing in video games is thus masculine and violent, specifically in a way that supports the patriarchal view of manhood.
During Ubisoft's presentation, a trailer for their upcoming game, Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Breakpoint, featured actor John Bernthal utter the line,
"The only test of a man's worth is battle,"
unwittingly distilling what seems to be a widespread perception among both players and game designers.
This is not a unique element to this medium. Popular art often presumes a dominant view onto its audience, and that predominant view is often patriarchal and white supremacist and cis-heteronormative. Who gets to gaze, how they gaze, and who we are expected to participate in gazing with are elements of all mediums. The power of gaze is, after all, deeply political and central to art. In the context of gender, as Laura Mulvey puts it in Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema,
pleasure in looking has been split between active male and passive female.
The predominance of male avatars is a manifestation of the prevalence of this view. Avatars disproportionately being men makes literal the male gaze. These men
emerge as the representative of power in a further sense, as the bearer of the look of the spectator, transferring it behind the screen.
Player avatars, even more so than the protagonists of film, allow male players to
project his look onto that of his like, his screen surrogate, so that the power of the male protagonist as he controls events coincides with the active power of the erotic look.
In the majority of games, the player gets to participate in the male protagonist's act of controlling events. Interestingly, this also results in the player observing their avatar as they control them. They are surveyor and surveyed. Now if, as Berger suggests in ways of seeing, being a woman is being surveyor and surveyed, then one could argue the relationship between a player avatar and the player within a video game is in some ways feminine, despite any creator intention. However, I don't think this aspect of surveyor and surveyed is so specific to just women's experiences. What Berger discusses in that section of ways of seeing heavily echoes elements of the work of, for example, W.E.B. Du Bois on the concept of double consciousness.
It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder.
I would argue that all marginalized people experience some form of this, a self and the self that is observing that self, aware of that gaze of others. To be clear, the intricacies and the nuances of these experiences are not interchangeable. There is, however, reflective patterns of thought and experience that I have noticed within personal discussion and academic examination of the marginalized experience. That feeling of being both surveyed and surveyor. As such, I think it is fair to say that the experience of the player being their avatar and observing their avatar simultaneously can lend itself to simulating an element of marginalized experiences. This is especially clear in third-person games, where the player avatar is always observable and also simultaneously is the player and the camera. In both cases, marginalization and the relationship between player and avatar, there is a tension between two selves.
Of disparate and competing thoughts, strivings, and ideals. This is not an episodic or occasional sensation, but a persistent form of consciousness.
This all furthers my view that video games and interactive mediums are uniquely capable of representing marginalized perspectives in a way that a privileged audience may genuinely connect with and not just observe externally. However, there will always be some degree of pushback from privileged audiences when this occurs. As seen earlier with response to Hades 2 and Assassin's Creed, some men become very upset at the prospect of playing as anything other than a man. Some white people get upset at the prospect of playing anything other than a white person, because for them, it to some degree confronts their concept of who can and cannot be the bearer of the look. I believe that everyone to some extent seeks to be seen and reflected, Protagonists, and especially player avatars, don't just exist inside the mirror, but are to some degree the mirror itself. In a media environment saturated with representative reflections, privileged individuals are very rarely confronted with a mirror not crafted specifically for them. Marginalized people, on the other hand, constantly have to find ourselves in mirrors actively rejecting us. In those moments where they're confronted, many privileged people very suddenly understand exactly why representation matters, but are unwilling or so shockingly unself-aware that they cannot apply what they're feeling to what others might desire. As one of them so succinctly put it,
I'm a guy, I want to play as a guy.
I guarantee if he pointed out to this exact anti-woke warrior, if the same principle applies for women, he would have a very different opinion about our desire to be reflected.
Stanley had once again paused the video. This was not the correct thing to do, and Stanley knew it. It was a wonder Stanley had ever managed to keep a job, considering he couldn't follow instructions. Just then, Stanley pondered how embarrassing it would look if he was caught seemingly pausing any time the essay criticized privileged people. Surely Stanley wouldn't want to be judged for that. Surely Stanley wouldn't want to be one of those men that get upset when women choose the bear. Oh, come on, Stanley. I'm trying to get you to consider something. Now go ahead and click play again. You're nearly at the part that's about you. Oh dear, Stanley seems to have clicked on a different video. Perhaps he mistook play the video as an instruction to click something else, because he is so bad at listening. Unluckily for Stanley, it was about the same topic.
Welcome to Tirrrb on youtube.com/Tirrrb.
I feel like we're too chaotic to it in person. Yeah, if you haven't seen them, Tirrrb and I have done videos together before. I've written on a lot of your stuff. You've consulted and done voices and things on my stuff. Anyway, I just felt like it would be really valuable to discuss what video game avatars mean in an intersectional context and the, let's say, interesting response that a lot of gamers TM have to characters looking like either of us.
I chalk it down to the gaze and what the audience wants to see, and I feel like that's a continuation of social adherence that we see in the modern day taking form in the precedent of a video game avatar. Like the first video game I ever got that was a black video game was this video game in the 2000s surrounding 50 Cent. I can't really find a lot of mask representation that I can relate to in media. Fucking Clementine, she's like 5 years old. That's it. The bar is in her. The bar is in her.
Genuinely, off the top of my head, can't really think of any like major video game characters that are trans. Like, we're allowed to be like side characters. I guess there's that one game by the creators of Life is Strange that has a trans guy. It's one of the main characters, but most of the time we're not playable. In the case of like black mask presentation, you're almost only playable within a very slim type of behaviors.
And it's commonly stereotypical. Black mask has a gun in a gang shooting people. Same thing with black femmes, like in the sense of sexualization. But in a video game connotation, this shit's very strictly and rigidly set up. Like people on the hood in Roblox coded that game to be that way. Which is like not what a lot of people are understanding. This isn't a depiction of real life. It doesn't talk about police brutality that happens in interstates. It doesn't talk about like lack of like funding for schools, lack of funding for like programs and things like that. No, all it shows is people gives you a gun, puts you in like an inner city neighborhood, says recreate your fantasy. If I were to talk more so about my experience relating to games, a lot of games take influence from black culture and flip it into really cool concepts, like the game Jet Set Radio, which is basically just about anarchist roller skaters, a fascistic government that's taken over the music industry and used it to monopolize the whole city, and they go around like spray painting everything and doing flips and listening to rap music and everything. To me as a kid, that was cool. I was like, I related to a lot of those characters, even though only like 2 of those characters were black. I related to a lot of those characters. I liked a lot of those characters. It made me feel seen in a way. I guess that's just me taking the bare minimum and going like, yes, but you don't always have to incorporate something 100% for the soul to be there, you know?
Mhm.
I really liked that game for what it was.
Well, I think an important part that you hit on there is that aspect of cultural representation. There's something I talked about with the Fallout stuff with like, oh, you can totally play queer romance, but it's not a queer romance. I don't know, the relationship that I have with my girlfriend now is a lesbian relationship, and there is aspects to that that go deeper than just the surface level a woman is dating a woman. Outside of the fact that we're both trans is more complicated than that, but just to oversimplify both of our identities. Like, I think when people are gazing from that external standpoint and they want to represent, they can do the sort of surface level markers, but they kind of miss the deeper cultural connection.
Yeah.
I know earlier when we were talking, like before we were recording, you talked about GTA and how people didn't get mad at Franklin being a protagonist because he was filling that stereotype.
Yeah,
that
he wasn't
hood
woke.
game
Yeah, he
also
wasn't
does.
woke to the conservative mind, basically. He wasn't woke. But a samurai is woke. Like a samurai in Japan is woke, so they try to cancel it. Like
Despite being the first time that Assassin's Creed's ever had a playable character that it was a real person.
The first Assassin's Creed was literally set in Egypt. It was literally African, and it's a white character. Why are you mad? Why are you mad?
They feel so entitled to that position of subjecthood, that position of being the bearer of the look, as I talk about in the section with Mulvey. I think both of us relate on that aspect of like, we don't get to be seen. Or if we do get to be seen,
it's in a certain way.
Right, it's a very certain way, and it's not a helpful way, it's a very harmful way.
This isn't an original idea, by the way. Shout out to Haryana Hook. Haryana Hook. Yeah, well, I was writing my essay on The Idol along all this while ago. Haryana Hook reminded me that, like, structurally, a lot of people in these rooms, a lot of people in these writing rooms, a lot of people in these coding rooms, a lot of people, you know, over there are cis, white, hetero men. So when we talk about the possibility of marginalized characters, we also have to talk about incorporating marginalized people in those spaces. We need black femmes and masks to take the mantle and create the stories that they want, not like with the help of people, but we know companies are bigoted and that'll never happen.
It really is a culture issue too. You know, the essay's really focused on the art side. I'm glad that you brought this up to have a little bit more of a conversation about who makes that art. Mm-hmm. Because if you're only ever allowing the same people to write the stories and you're only ever allowing the same people to imagine, well, they're going to keep imagining the same things.
Yeah, and we've seen what they imagine. It's not that good.
And now, a word from our sponsor.
This video is brought to you by my patrons. If you're enjoying the video, consider supporting the Patreon. That way I get fed, and you get art you enjoy. As well, patrons get early access to new videos, scripts, and some smaller exclusive content, all without ads. Please also support the various wonderful artists who lend me their voices, particularly Tirrrb. They all make excellent work, and you can find their channels linked in the description. I also recommend reading the papers I'm citing, which can be found in the sources doc, which is as always down below. In that doc, I also included a recommended video section on related topics that I highly recommend you go watch. I will be updating it anytime I find other works on this topic.
We return you now to your regularly scheduled program.
Would you say that the game benefited from allowing you more choices? Feel free to be honest.
In Ways of Seeing Essay 3, Berger places women as being incapable of achieving subject status. It's almost a form of patriarchy realism, similar to Mark Fisher's concept of capitalist realism, an inability to imagine women seeing ourselves without participating in patriarchal objectification. A woman, according to Berger,
turns herself into an object, and most particularly an object of vision, a sight.
In Essay 1, Berger states,
The invention of the camera also changed the way in which men saw paintings painted long before the camera was invented. The uniqueness of every painting was once part of the uniqueness of the place where it resided. Sometimes the painting was transportable, but it could never be seen in two places at the same time. When the camera reproduces a painting, it destroys the uniqueness of the image. As a result, its meaning changes, or more exactly, its meaning multiplies and fragments into many meanings.
This touches on something Susan Stryker mentions in transgender history.
Back in the analog era, a representation, a word, an image, or an idea, was commonly assumed to point to some real thing. A person's social and psychological gender was commonly assumed to point to that person's biological sex in exactly the same way. Gender was considered a representation of a physical sex, but a digital image or sound is something else entirely. It's unclear exactly how it's related to the world of physical objects. It doesn't point to some real thing in quite the same way, and it might in fact be a complete fabrication built up pixel by pixel or bit by bit. Transgender gender representation works the same way.
When players engage with, connect to, and embody different avatars, they breach the rules of a representation pointing to some real-world object, much like Stryker discusses of trans representation of gender. When marginalized players take control of the camera, of the avatar, we reassert our ability to gaze in spaces where we've been previously denied. While all art is uniquely experienced to some extent, video games are unique in that each player gets their own version of that story because the actions they take, how well they do those actions, how long it takes to do things, and the type of story they end up with are all going to be unique to their play session. This acts similar to the destruction of image uniqueness discussed by Berger, however it, instead, destroys the uniformity of image reproduction. Each individual recreation is different, even if sometimes only subtly, but this has a potential for players to commandeer the camera in such a way as to destroy the expected dominant gaze. This little stinky man hates when I record videos. He hates it. He's like, Mother, I don't want you to record videos. I don't like it. It upsets my little baby belly. I'm just a widow kitty cat. You can be in here, but only if you're sitting on my lap. Video games, by decentralizing the camera from the creator and placing it in the hands of the player, especially when the player is able to create the vessel through which they engage, destroys the idea of a central artistic perspective. It democratizes the gaze. It polyfragments meaning even further than the original camera did.
Oh, he's just a sleepers.
Ludonarrative thus becomes a meeting point between player and author, where the viewer becomes in part an author themselves. As such, the distinction between the subject that is viewing and the object that is viewed is blurred. The act of forcing an audience to not just passively experience a marginalized perspective, but actively engage with and be tethered to the marginalized, creates an opportunity for excellent connection and understanding. However, that requires marginalized representation that doesn't reinforce pre-existing biases and harmful stereotypes. By making the avatar marginalized, the marginalized identity fundamentally becomes subject. They are the camera, they are the gaze, they are the bearer of the look, and they are the primary one acting on the world. Player avatars are not inherently or exclusively subjects with agency. Many games play with the amount of agency you have within their design, but generally, the primary character to take actions on a world, the primary character with the freedom to enact change, is the player avatar. After all, in most games, there is no story, there is no action, there is no change until players and their avatars act on that world. In Davey Wreden and William Pugh's 2014 game The Stanley Parable and its reimagined deluxe edition, the player controls Stanley.
Stanley worked for a company in a big building where he was employee number 427. Employee number 427's job was simple. He sat at his desk in room 427 and he pushed buttons on a keyboard.
One day his coworkers disappear and the commands stop coming. This is when the player takes control of Stanley. Stanley is truly an empty vessel. He has no agency until the player imbues them with agency. The entire game is about framing and control. The player, throughout every single route, is engaging with the decision to follow or not follow a set path given by a narrator. The more the player controls Stanley to deny the narrator's story, the more irritated the narrator becomes.
This was not the correct way to the meeting room, and Stanley knew it perfectly well. Stanley was so bad at following directions, it's incredible he wasn't 5 years ago. Aha! Perhaps you misunderstood. Stanley walked through the red door. Was it worth ruining the entire story I'd written out specifically for you?
In some routes, the narrator almost revels in mocking the lack of control Stanley has over the narrative.
If you want to throw my story off track, you're going to have to do much better than that.
Regardless of the route one chooses to play in the Stanley Parable, to some extent you are always within the confines of instructions given by the designers. Even as one can frustrate the narrator, they're not technically truly breaching the narratives of the game designers.
When every path you can walk has been created for you long in advance, death becomes meaningless, making life the same. Do you see now? Do you see that Stanley was already dead from the moment he hit start?
A lot of games that explore player agency and choice wrestle with the idea that I call the would you kindly conundrum. Spoilers for Bioshock 1, throughout the game the player avatar is manipulated using the phrase, would you kindly?
Would you kindly? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find it? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly head to Ryan's office and kill the son of a bitch?
An activation phrase that compels them to do whatever they are instructed to. Metatextually, the player, much like the avatar, has been doing whatever they are told by a system. The player and the avatar are meant to have a synthesis of experience where both are realizing at the same time that they have been unquestioningly following the commands of others. The would you kindly conundrum comes down to a very simple question. If given only a small set of choices by a system, are you truly free to choose, or are you merely acting on the whims of others? Do you truly have freedom if you can only choose from what has been offered to you by the powerful? And what do you miss if you accept those choices? My issue with a lot of the discussion of this is I believe it buys into the false presumption that one must choose within those systems, within those options presented to them. But if one is daring, one can bend and perhaps break intended perspective. Achieving that just requires taking more drastic measures to wrestle control back, to do things that very actively break the very systems that one has been placed within. While the game designer creates and molds the context in which a player experiences a world, unlike a passive medium, players can truly push at and even potentially rip through the very boundaries of that world. This isn't even a figurative concept. I do mean quite literally. It's most obvious in instances of boundary breaking and camera glitches. Instances where a player literally breaches all limits that have been placed upon them to see into the very guts of the world. They view it from perspectives that creators could never have even imagined they would, and probably don't want them to. This reflects Legacy Russell's concept of a glitch feminism, an area of study that
embraces the causality of error and turns the gloomy implication of glitch on its ear by acknowledging that an error in a social system that has already been disturbed by economic, racial, social, sexual, and cultural stratification, and the imperialist wrecking ball of globalization, processes that continue to enact violence on all bodies, may not in fact be an error at all, but rather a much-needed erratum. This glitch is a correction to the machine, and in turn, a positive departure.
These glitches allow us to
the ability to manipulate one's gaze in the face of structures of domination that would contain it, opening up the possibility of agency.
Players participate in the denial of creator intentions through challenge runs and speed runs. Some speedrunners literally rely on breaking the game in order to achieve the speed and time they're searching for. A common form of challenge run are pacifist playthroughs of games where violence is intended to be the primary way of seeing. Video game modding is another popular method of altering how a game can be played. The mod hosting website Nexus boasts on their homepage at time of writing that they
host 548,331 mods for 2,750 games from 130,039 authors serving 47,892,375 members with 10,279,778,693 downloads to date.
Mods like Pacifist Valley, which take the idea of pacifist routes and actively make them a game mechanic, much more easily accommodating different players' access and agency in how they engage with a world. For another example, mods that change character models for each other to demonstrate the disparity in how characters are animated. Players and modders illuminate the popular view by actively subverting and destroying it. Video games are a unique medium where authorial intent goes to die. It's not just ignored, it is actively discarded and trampled on, for better and for worse.
Bro, you call somebody ugly, that's not an identity, that's just a fact. I don't understand how mind-broken people are that they can't understand the idea that people want to play a character that's hot. And especially if it's a chick.
Games devoid of sexual content are often modified by men to add in a more explicit sexual male gaze. Doom turns the objects used for masculine violence in Doom into objects for patriarchal masculine sexual satisfaction. The concerning implications of viewing sex as a conquest done by men onto feminine figures and substituting it directly into the role guns and murder occupy are, I would hope, fairly obvious. It's easy to find nudity mods for most games. For one example, sorting by all-time most popular mods for Skyrim Special Edition on Mod Nexus, you'll find Caliente's Beautiful Bodies Enhancer,
a completely customizable female body replacer for the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim.
at 11th place. Skyrim is useful as a marker, as it's one of the most successful games for mods on the site.
And now, some very normal quotes from Caliente's developers. Get in character, Darkfry. The push together slider is a really nice addition to get awesome cleavage when used correctly. New sliders in 2.0. Crotch, puffiness. Crotch, cute puffiness. Nipples, areola pull. Nipples, shy. Nipples, more puffy. And butt, saggy.
Even within the original unmodified versions of games, the vast majority of characters unclothed in video games are, as Berger and Clark would define it, nudes of women. Often found in either fantasy creatures to be killed, such as the harpies and other feminine monsters of early Elder Scrolls, or Dark Souls, or in the voyeuristic sex scenes of works like God of War, The Witcher series, Grand Theft Auto, and Mass Effect.
To be naked is simply to be without clothes, whereas the nude is a form of art. The nude is often conventionalized, and the authorities for its conventions derives from a certain tradition of art. A naked body has to be seen as an object in order to become a nude.
Women characters' bodies are shown nude in a way that invites the audience to ogle, to act upon sexually, or to even commit violence against.
According to the principles of the ruling ideology and the physical structures that back it up, the male figure cannot bear the burden of sexual objectification. Man is reluctant to gaze at his exhibitionist like.
While editing this section, I had to actually look up a lot of the specific mods and things that men add to games. And I knew it was bad. You know, I'd heard about things like Doom, but actually going through and looking at it, just the amount of men who modify games to allow them to do sexual violence against naked women was very upsetting. It was a very unpleasant process to work on this section of this chapter, and I didn't put some of the most upsetting stuff in because while I wanted to make the point that this stuff exists and it is observable so that people can't deny its existence, I didn't fully register just how bad it was until I did that. I don't really know what to say. It just is really fucking telling that so many people view violently assaulting naked women as a fantasy to the extent that they would go out of their way to change art to include it is pretty depressing and extremely gross. Anyway, back to the scripted, thought-out stuff.
Why are we still here? Just to suffer?
Video game sex scenes are often devoid of control, exiting from an interactive media context briefly to re-establish the audience as viewers and not participants in that moment. Men regain their position as the bearers of the look. In instances where control remains, the audience participates in the male subject using these digital reproductions of women as objects, such as the previously mentioned God of War. Players are either acting onto women or voyeuristically experiencing the man do so. When a game shifts to passive viewership, it still retains that unification of the looks on either side of the screen, which Mulvey discusses in the section Women as Image, Men as Bearer of the Look.
Woman then stands in patriarchal culture as signifier of the male other, bound by a symbolic order in which man can live out his fantasies and obsessions through linguistic command by imposing them on the silent image of woman still tied to her place as bearer of meaning, not maker of meaning.
Video game avatar men get to make meaning through not just linguistic but physical command. The NPC women bear the meaning devoid of the agency afforded avatars.
He is the spectator in front of the picture, and he is presumed to be a man. Everything is addressed to him. Everything must appear to be the result of him being there. It is for him that the figures have assumed their nudity.
The Tirrrbian arguments in terms of how women are handled are frequent amongst defenders of the medium's worst elements. Take, for instance, Bayonetta's voyeuristic camera, often taking extreme or unusual positions to capture elements of her body in a leering manner. Even as a player controls Bayonetta, the game attempts to distance player from Avatar, to not allow the player to fully connect, to try and return them to a position of pure audience, in a way male action game stars such as Dante from Devil May Cry, or Platinum Games' other work such as Raiden and Metal Gear Rising Revengeance do not. In some ways, this functions like the mirror within medieval paintings as Berger discussed them.
The mirror was often used as a symbol of the vanity of woman. The moralizing, however, was mostly hypocritical. You painted a naked woman because you enjoyed looking at her. You put a mirror in her hand and you called the painting vanity, thus morally condemning the woman whose nakedness you had depicted for your own pleasure. The real function of the mirror was otherwise. It was to make the woman connive in treating herself as, first and foremost, a sight.
Various elements imply a vanity to her, while truly only highlighting the artist's own miscomprehension of women. When feminists have critiqued the game's handling of this, defenders have tried to argue that Bayonetta, the character, is purposefully suggestive, so it can't be objectifying. That her character wants the audience to view her that way, as if she was a real person making a choice and not the creation of artists. A sort of backfiring of the connection the medium can create. To these defenders, Bayonetta the character is in some ways more real than women they encounter. Rather than taking their experience of her as a subject and applying it to women in general, they have taken it to imply that she cannot be objectified. Their argument falls apart because the same men who placed the camera between her legs wrote her to be sexually provocative. The idea that this is a woman reclaiming her sexuality as an empowering element falls apart when you remember that she is a manufactured idea given shape through polygons and pixels and wire and acting. It collapses when you look at how she is treated by the camera, by the perspective of her creators, and when compared to men within similar works of art. She is, in the end, a digital recreation of an imagined woman within the eyes of a group of mostly men. Even though some of those who worked on Bayonetta, including one of the character designers, are women, that doesn't remove how the character is treated by the camera or the writing.
You want to touch me?
These Tirrrbian arguments also often extend to why women have to be wearing frankly absurd outfits in many games. Take, for instance, armor that covers nothing in fantasy games. Full offense, you can't convince me boob-shaped plate is good armor, or that having your tits and pussy out is helping you in combat. For another example, take every annoying dude's favorite auteur Kojima and the character Silent from MGS5. Silent just has to be basically naked. He has enhanced skin. She can't breathe if she has clothes on. Never mind that that's an ad hoc reasoning for why she's dressed like that, invented by those writers. Just because there's a reason in the lore doesn't change it was a choice by a creative team to present women in that way. And look, I'm a lesbian. I love boobs too. I love beautiful women. It's fine to be horny, but at least admit that's what you're doing. Especially when you're objectifying women for sexual gratification. There is a difference between seeing us as sexy and seeing us as a sexual fetish object. Just look at how many men have taken completely normal-looking women from games or from promotional material and fixed them by making them bimbified Barbies.
Or
tower.
Well, you see, it's a gamer pad. Not many girls come in here because I get friend zoned so frequently.
Have you ever actually interacted with a woman in your life, Mephiles?
That doesn't matter.
It's actually disgusting to take a real actress and airbrush her ass to be bigger just because it's more sexually gratifying to you. And I know the weird fantasies some of you have about me because I've had to fucking read them in my comments section. The way that y'all view digital women often intersects with the way that you treat real women like me in the real world. And you need to start questioning the way that you have been trained to view us. We are not objects for you. We will never be objects for you. This is not for you. With that said, while nudity dominates the field's handling of bodies, nakedness, characters just being unclothed, does appear in some newer character creators. Specifically, character creators which allow the player to select character genitalia in a non-parasex or cis-normative manner. Each gender and each type of body is placed very neutrally within the character creators of Baldur's Gate 3 and Cyberpunk 2077, for instance. This presentation of a body deemed non-normative by patriarchy as something neutral is a profoundly unique experience in mainstream art. To speak from the personal, it was the first time that I saw a body that resembles mine as it currently exists. Avatar creation is to some extent asking the player to create their own body through which they will experience the world, if the avatar is you, and to be naked is to be oneself. And the avatar acts as a subject within the world, then this presentation is nakedness under Clark and Berger's definition of it. Character creators in general allow for an opportunity, though one rarely actively capitalized on, for many different people to see themselves represented within the subject that is an avatar. Inclusive character creators allow marginalized players, regardless of their specific identities, to see ourselves represented within a player avatar. However, most games still generally represent only a small amount of options, especially for marginalized players. This touches on what I said earlier. It's not really freedom when you're heavily restricted by a biased system. This is often subverted by player bases making character creator enhancement mods. Companies making character creators need to be considerate of many different intersecting identities in order to be representative. For example, if a character designer cannot represent blackness, not just skin, but hair and dress and cultural signifiers, and for people like several of my black trans friends, their gender is black, then one cannot really claim inclusivity on the grounds of gender and sexuality. For those at the intersections, both elements must be present in order to be represented. If you can only play skinny, abled, cis, and/or white characters, that's not representative. For marginalized players, the ideal of getting to see ourselves that character creators seem to fulfill is confronted by systems which restrict the options such that we are not seen. Sexuality should also be considered when making character creators. Romanceable companions in video games with character creators represent an incredible possibility for players to experiment with their sexuality. However, more often than not, it leads to a writing style that does not treat these companions as whole beings with their own desires, wants, and sexual identity. They are attracted to the player avatar because they are there to service the player's gaze. Characters written this way are sometimes referred to as player sexual. Bethesda Softworks open-world games are particularly popular examples, with Skyrim being the 8th highest grossing game of all time according to IGN as of February 9th, 2024. Lydia, a character in Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, only needs to be gifted a locket in order to romance and marry. Before doing so, she repeats morosely,
I am sworn to carry your burdens. All right, what is it?
This was the first result I found while searching for this. Just some men. Ugh. Editing this entire section's just constantly finding things that are even worse than I remember them being. A woman annoyed me, therefore violence time. Jesus.
She is a servant, gained by completing a quest, functionally no different than the sword gifted to you by the same Jarl. She's loot. Her only wants are to do whatever the player wants, to fight for them, die for them, or love them, to carry their burdens. whichever they choose. She is an object of status to be purchased through doing a quest and giving a digital reproduction of a signifier of wealth. The company's follow-up game, Fallout 4, takes this narrative disinterest in the inner worlds of romanceable characters further. Every companion that is romanceable in the game is romanceable regardless of the player's gender. Only binary genders, by the way. The reason for this is not to show that bisexuality is more common in this world, it's merely to serve the player. As with so many elements of the companion writing, there can be no real friction between you and them. This results in a strange reality where none of these characters have a sexual identity. None of their interactions with the world are informed by their sexuality, and none of them have an opinion in any meaningful way on any action the player can take. The player avatar begins the game in a cis-heteronormative marriage where you had a baby with your spouse and live in the future imagined by 1950s American suburbia. You're then forced into a vault as a nuclear war consumes the world, and many years later your child is kidnapped and your spouse is killed. You cannot change this. The entire game's primary quest hook is built off of seeking revenge for your dead spouse and finding your son.
War never changes.
The game's opening monologue is done from the white, expected main character man's point of view, a specifically pro-American war veteran.
War never changes.
You're gonna knock him dead at the Veterans Hall tonight, hun.
You think?
The only voice actors for player characters are white. The game, even as it supports player-created avatars, writes from an expectation of the player being an American, Christian, straight, white, cis man. Playing the game as a lesbian, for instance, and romancing a woman doesn't really reflect a queer experience of attraction and dating, but rather a straight romance where some identities happen to be substituted in. There are no real writing differences between a queer and straight romance with the companions. Which is odd, because despite your character ostensibly living in a straight marriage in the white American suburbs in a culture that resembles 1950s suburbia, they have no real opinion or option to have an opinion on their queerness, or to even come out as queer to other characters or to a prospective partner. Even when a game allows for players to choose aspects of their avatar, it can still avoid actually accommodating for a marginalized way of seeing. If you can only choose what a character looks like and how they act within the limits of an artificial system created by dominant views, then it's arguable whether that constitutes representation at all or just recuperation. We can be included as an afterthought, but the game's marketing can still rely on selling a male power fantasy and a male gaze. The writing can also ignore our existence and just swap a few pronouns into some phrases.
Stanley, have you stopped again because you use those mods? Oh, Stanley, you dirty dog. No wonder the video was making you uncomfortable. Stanley thought he'd had it bad, because it was an omnipresent narrator forcing him through repeating paths often ending in pain. But at least no one was spending excessive amounts of time remodeling Stanley to be sexually attractive for them. Isn't that right? No? Well, Stanley, then what is it? Stanley, are you sexually frustrated and jealous because women get attention? Oh my, Stanley, surely you aren't spending that much time on Reddit. Perhaps Stanley would have an easier time with the interview.
How does it affect you when you go to play a game and it says you can make someone that looks like you?
Well, it's
and
just
you can't.
It's just kind of been normal. Like, I can't ever name a game where I cycled through and I was like, oh, I can make someone that looks exactly like me. I've never played a game like that. So to me, it's like even looking for an avenue or some kind of vessel to embody me, it's not even there. Like, it's never been there. And I was having a talk with some of my white friends before about the aspect of seeing privilege, and they were like, oh, all my conversations revolve around how can I make people be seen? And mine is like, how can I be seen? I don't really relate to cookie cutter black stories. Like, shifts in characters, like, blackness isn't a monolith, and obviously I'm not trying to co-opt y'all Americans, okay? I'm a black Canadian. I grew up in Edmonton, Alberta. Like, I had a very different experience where it's like, I thought I was Southern Sudanese when I came here, but then the white people looked at me and they were like, black. And then everyone else looked at me, they were like, black. Black didn't even exist where I lived, honestly. Like, everyone was black in Egypt. But when we came here, like, blackness has a very different connotation in Edmonton than it did in Cairo, obviously. That was a very weird thing for my parents to take in. And me too. Like, that was a dual shock of like, whoa. Like, they're trying to make me this thing that I've never been my whole entire life. But you grow up and you learn to act in black community, you learn to be it, you learn you are it, unfortunately. And like all these, unfortunately too, it's a two sides to the coin. I love being black, but like, yeah.
I feel that as a queer person, as a trans person, I think there's a lot projected onto us about it. And when you have to contend with your entire life having an identity thrown at you, an identity that the people throwing it view as an insult, it also makes it very hard to engage with those identities to some extent, because the positive aspects are still colored by that experience of being othered. And I think when games continue to constantly place a sort of onus of subjectivity, of being able to act in the world into the hands of these same privileged people, it's a furtherance of that feeling of like, you're not supposed to be here. And this is touched best on something you talked about much earlier, which is that like, you're so used to never getting to create a character that looks like you that you don't even really think about it.
Yeah.
Like, that says something really profound about the normalization of these dominant views. I hadn't really thought about the fact that didn't really see trans bodies in character creators. I think it really slapped me in the face when I opened up Baldur's Gate 3 and when I opened up Cyberpunk 2077, and it allowed for a non-cisnormative, non-paranormative body like that. For me, that's shocking in a good way. But I think for a lot of people who are invested in dominant thinking, it's shocking in an upsetting or negative way, because it's upsetting their comfortable space where they don't have to think about us existing.
And when we talk about why people create certain characters for certain games too, it can be extremely telling. I promise you, if you load up any white boys NBA 2K, they will be like a 6'5" shooting guard light skin. Like, I promise you. But if you log onto their Call of Duty, they'll be the white guy. You know what I mean? Like, it's like those avenues like those avenues of representation that we get, they can literally wield on like a whim of like, I'm just gonna be a black guy for today and play basketball. Now I'm gonna be a white guy, I'm gonna shoot people now in the Call of Duty lobby and say the N-word. You know, like it's the sort of negative side of the avatars. I think privileged people see avatars as merely tools. They refuse to sort of empathize or view them as not obviously, I'm not saying people should be seeing fictional characters as literally real people, but not seeing them as characters or things that are worth emotionally engaging with, I guess. They can use it without being empathetic. I know there's a lot of people who watch our video essays and take these critiques like very personally. So this is for all you like video game developers, all you people that play video games, all you people that like interact with video games, all you people that do the discourse, right? I'm not saying you have to be 100% perfect. I'm not saying you have to watch this video over 30 times and get it completely perfect, get it completely down. First, all I'm telling you is put some people in community, like-minded, around you. I'm not even gonna lie. I'm telling you to get a black friend. I'm telling you to get a trans friend. I'm telling you to get a gay friend. I'm telling you to get a bi friend. Like, you will learn so much. You will learn so much just from like talking to them, just from listening to them, just like learning from them, even just learning from their art styles, how they draw hair. A lot of artists tell me like I never even knew how to draw like black skin on like canvas paper. What? Like, I feel like that's a failure to society as a whole if you can't capture an experience, at least from like a viewpoint of a black person, right? Like, you have them looking like a minstrel the whole downtime because you're too scared to get one black artist friend, bro. Break out of your like, I'm telling you, it's not hard. Not hard. There's a lot of barriers. But we're not telling you to quit your dreams. We're just telling you to go and try something new.
I think that's a big point is try, but also like We are talking about this, and if you're willing to fucking listen, you can learn. You are never going to fucking win with these gamer TM fanboy dickheads. You're not. And if you keep trying to cater to them when you create avatars, you keep shifting the bar further and further towards worse representation and worse writing, worse character development, worse experiences for the marginalized people that want to be a part of these communities. And like, it's so frustrating to me because so much of video game culture, I think, has been built by queer people, by black people, by trans people, and especially the intersections of those identities.
And also in psychology, I forget what this term is, but when you're given affirmation a certain way your whole entire life, you'll look to seek affirmation in those avenues, right? So when you're treated like a monster and you're given these avenues of, I guess, comfortability and like appraisal, then you're naturally going to want to steer towards that way.
The acceptable representation, the acceptable performance. These are the stereotypes and the roles that you're allowed to fill. I think it's not just important for marginalized characters to be avatars because it allows us to see ourselves as subjects, as I talk about in the essay, but I think it's also important because it allows us to
like feel
see ourselves beyond the limited tropes that we've been allowed to in the past. Earlier you said it really stifles conversations. I think part of that stifling comes from when we're always under attack. If we always have to fucking justify being on screen, even a tiny amount, we're spending all our energy on that and we don't get to actually like have any sort of deeper conversations, deeper experiences, deeper engagement.
But I also think the aspect of identity or community is so easy to attack because for cis hetero people, they don't have to hide. They don't have to look at a flag and be like, oh, that's straight pride. Like, no, they walk outside and it's straight pride, right? Like
every day is straight pride. The world is straight pride.
The world is catered for whiteness. The world is catered for things like that. Yeah. So when they see something that like obstructs that, they're like, oh fuck, shit, that's different. Woke, and that's it. That's it.
The hero is just a doll. But so are the children. The real game's what's happening between you and us.
Video games' popularity, much like Hollywood cinema, as discussed by Mulvey,
arose from its skilled and satisfying manipulation of visual pleasure.
In the last few decades, much has been taken from Hollywood and how mainstream games present elements visually, including much of the filmic techniques that constitute the male gaze. These elements are used to add to how the medium can explore pleasure experientially and visually. John Carmack, one of the creators of Doom, is quoted as saying, "Story in a game is like story in a porn movie. It's expected to be there, but it's not that important." The creators of these games were making pornographic violence. Players who seek out the type of satisfaction mods like H-Doom seek to provide are really just extending what the work was already trying to give players to some extent. Now, to be clear, pornography and pleasure are not negative things, but it is worth examining how dominant views appear in those elements of satisfaction and pleasure. Just because pornography is not inherently negative doesn't mean that it can't be patriarchal and harmful. In these contexts, non-player characters can very easily become nothing more than fetish objects for a male power fantasy. Video games are often sold on that fantasy. As discussed, even games with the options for other avatars still advertise with men primarily. Avatars are also used as status symbols to some extent within multiplayer online games. Players can purchase virtual representations of status in the form of cosmetics. Like the advertising discussed by Berger in Essay 7 of Ways of Seeing, both these status symbols and the power fantasies of games rely on player dissatisfaction.
The purpose of publicity is to make the spectator marginally dissatisfied with his present way of life, not with the way of life of society, but with his own within it. It suggests that if he buys what it is offering, his life will become better. It offers him an improved alternative to what he is.
However, unlike the tangible objects that are idealized in the advertising digital reproductions Berger discusses, these games and cosmetics are not selling you on a better life, but on the digital representation of having that life. What's worth noting is these modes of advertising demonstrate that avatars are a powerful extension to self to some extent, one that is exploited by dominant systems. While the player knows they are separated from the avatar, the cosmetics in the avatar come to represent them. Even the functional PAR demonstrates this element of seeing the avatar as connected to self. However, they eradicate the avatar's personhood while doing so, seeing the avatar as a tool that represents status rather than a person, or character to be more exact. When people discuss playing games and the actions of their avatars, they primarily say, I did, or me, or my. Often they're also experiencing being referred to as the character. They're identified together. There are, of course, exceptions that draw attention to this disconnection and connection that treat the player themselves as a character within the diegesis. But these are rare, and often exist as meta-commentary on video games.
Venerable Bachelor, please be so kind as to linger for a minute. This conversation won't take too much of your time, especially since time stops during dialogues, at least during the important ones. And our dialogue is extremely important. You need to know how to play, after all, don't you?
Play? What are you talking about? Mask Man? I'm neither a gambler nor an actor.
Of course you aren't. You're a living, breathing man. As is evident from your conditions and statuses, you experience hunger, thirst, and fatigue. You suffer from pain, wounds, and diseases. You're so lifelike.
In Pathologic HD Edition, my favorite game of all time, the player is given the choice between 3 very different avatars, each with a unique experience of the town on the Gorkon, the setting of the game. The game is framed as a theater performance, and I truly think this is the most accurate way of representing the relationship between players and avatars. It's like being an actor on a stage, given a role. Every route of Pathologic exhibits a unique, often contradictory perspective on the same set of events. You're expected to perform each of these perspectives because Pathologic, unlike most games, truly understands how avatars can work as a way of experiencing a world, a way of both seeing and being seen. For example, in Daniil's route, there's often times where you encounter elements of the town's unique culture, which Daniil dismisses. He doesn't understand it, and he thinks it's backwards and incorrect. And due to this, he does things that actually sabotage helping the town. But this is something you'll only ever understand if you then play through the game as the Haruspex, Artem Burak. On the completion of a successful run of the game, where the player manages to save every single member of the Bound in town, the avatar is given the option to talk to the powers that be, the mysterious figures that have been guiding them to some extent. And the player is given the option to talk to the developers of the game in the form of the tragedian and an executor. The powers that be are a group of children playing with a magic sandbox, and your avatar is merely a doll they placed inside of that sandbox. Your avatar is then given the opportunity to have an opinion on that.
Look, Haruspex is here. He's so big. How'd you find us? Oh, so lifelike. And so angry.
You little pricks. Tell me everything you know before I beat the living hell out of you.
That's a child!
I must go punch that baby.
The developers of the video game instead talk to you, yes, you, about how your performance went.
The hero is just a doll. But so are the children. The real game's what's happening between you and us.
I cannot leave Haruspex's body. You're imposing your limits upon me.
Haruspex has lost his battle for freedom since the very day he was born. What about you?
I wanted to stop the epidemic.
But did you understand what the epidemic really was?
I know now that it was a children's game in a glass sandbox. But what for?
Was the disease the true evil, though? Disease is only a method. Was it really worth the effort? Look around.
All this for a single wretched town?
No, it was the town that had been built for you, not the other way around. We apologize if it's been a disappointment.
So you're curious as to what fate I will choose for the town?
We have to make sure that it's truly you who's making the decision. Are you absolutely positive that your choice is not predetermined by anyone or anything?
Could it have been otherwise?
Oh, absolutely. When every step you take's been predicted, you're still free to either take it or not. When it has been foreseen, however, you remain a mere puppet in someone else's hands.
Being my puppeteer is way too good a position for you.
The game very actively draws attention to that tension between two selves, between two halves, between player and avatar, between actor and role. Thus it becomes a metatextual discussion of the degree of including the avatar in the self.
You see how sad our fortune is. We put all our hopes in you. We poor actors are hoping you'd become the director of a new show. The old one has been beaten to death, but you turned out to be a doll.
But I'm not a doll. At least not that type of doll, anyway.
Did I hear you right? Who is it speaking?
It's me, the player.
Oh, then I apologize profusely. You are definitely not a doll. That seems to be unhelpful for our hero now. He's humiliated, crushed. But most importantly, he's deprived of the power that we all hoped for. By the way, are you still willing to take responsibility for him?
Yes. He is my responsibility. I will stay with him to the very end. His words shall be my words. His deeds shall be my deeds.
The avatar is, quite literally at the end of the game, a puppet, suffused with your will. Unlike the functional PARs discussed earlier, who view avatars as merely puppets devoid of any care or desire to understand their worldview or emotional experience, Pathologic says, this is a puppet, a mere vessel. Empathize with it. Understand it. Just because a work of art isn't real doesn't mean that the emotional experiences that you have from it are not real and not valuable. It very actively tries to get you to see the avatar as a unique person with their own viewpoint. What makes it even stranger is the feelings that Pathologic wants you to empathize with, because Pathologic wants you to suffer. It wants you to hurt. It wants you to be exhausted. It wants to wear you down, emotionally and physically. It forces you to feel the feelings, the frustrations, the pains, the triumphs of each of these avatars. It tells you they are a different person from you, a role that you're merely performing, and yet, even as they create that tension, they also manage to get you to connect more deeply with those avatars than almost any other game has ever managed to do for me. The tension between the other and the self, the distance between, is what video games can explore better than any other medium. They have a potential to create a unique, intimate comprehension of a completely different experience and worldview, but also the unfortunate potential to let you boil them down to nothing more than a tool. It is a medium where the experience of marginalization can be suffused with subjecthood, and yet the majority of the subjects within the medium are still white supremacist, patriarchal, and cis-heteronormative in nature. Video game avatars are vessels and cameras, perspectives on a world, and reflections of their creators' ways of seeing. Hopefully in the future, their potential can be realized in order to overcome the stagnation of the current dominant view being espoused.
The video had ended, and yet did Stanley learn anything? No, Stanley had not. He almost left a comment saying that women need to stop yapping, and there's no ethics in games journalism. Deleted, and instead decided to leave a comment that was frankly baffling.